The first Avengers film was a smash sensation in 2012 and led to the popularity of the MCU to grow massively. It was only natural that Marvel would continue these films as accumulations of storylines set up in Phase 2, hence Avengers Age of Ultron. Avengers Age of Ultron was a disappointing film for me when I saw it on opening day back in 2015. It was also the first film in the MCU Aiden and I reviewed for this channel back then with one of our drunk views. Our primary complaint at the time was that it was too quippy, and perhaps the fact that I was 16 when this film dropped meant I had no patience for all that.
Shit! Language!
I was growing out of the MCU a bit at that time. Now at 26, I have a different philosophy on the film. Do I think it's bad today? No. Do I think it's an improvement over the first film? Yeah, in ways. Though today I still think I can't bring myself to call it wholeheartedly good. In 2011, Kevin Feige announced a plan that was in place for Phase 2, something that would start with Iron Man 3 and end with the second Avengers film. That wouldn't exactly be how it ended up going down though, as Ant-Man is still considered Phase 2, with Phase 3 starting on Captain America Civil War. Joss Whedon was pretty much implied to take on the second Avengers film, with him initially pitching the idea of a smaller film than the first, but the scope continued to grow, causing it to basically be on par, but notably much more expensive, costing north of $400 million to create, being one of the most expensive films ever created. I guess so much for the concept of it being cheap. Initially, it wasn't a given, though, that Robert Downey Jr. would return, with his initial 4-film contract being fulfilled following Iron Man 3. However, he decided to come back due to the magic of money, hence them ending Tony's arc following Iron Man 3, then reopening Tony's arc again here. Also, hence why Robert Downey Jr. is set to star as Doctor Doom in the upcoming Avengers films. Joss Whedon, in writing this film, supposedly looked at films like The Empire Strikes Back and The Godfather 2 for inspiration, but fucking how? I'm not going to entertain this anecdote further because I don't see it at all. I just think it's something that any director of a film sequel says, since those are considered two of the few sequels that famously meet or surpass the first film. If I had $1 every time someone said this, I would be a rich man. This happens all the time in Hollywood. It's typically to be totally ignored. Regardless, Captain Marvel was considered to appear, though since she wasn't casted and there was already a lot of new characters in this film, they passed on that in favor of adding Vision, Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver. Quicksilver definitely being the most interesting addition to the cast, given that he was at the time part of the cast of the X-Men films over at Fox. It was some weird stuff with the odd and vague rights that Marvel handed over to the studios back in the day when they were outsourcing their film productions rather than doing them in-house. Quicksilver was one of the classic Avengers and was arguably more of an Avengers character around his creation, being on the second iteration of the team for quite a while before becoming more of an X-Men character, again, along with his sister Scarlet Witch. It's odd, and we'll talk about it a bit more later in this video. The early draft also had a hint towards the Planet Hulk storyline as adapted in Thor Ragnarok later on. This was not shown as they didn't want to put too much speculation that was the team's intention. The story behind why that was a Thor film plot and not, a Hulk plot is a story for when we cover that film down the line. But the gist is, as always, rights issues. Ultron was pretty quickly picked by Whedon to be the villain of this film as one of his favorite Avengers villains. Though with Tony Stark and Hulk on the team, Joss figured adding Hank Pym, Ultron's creator in the comics, to the story would be too much science talk for the audience. Not to mention Ant-Man was a character under production by Edgar Wright at the time, so he didn't want to step on any toes and decided to just make Ultron the creation of Tony and Bruce in the film. The film would cast James Spader as Ultron, Elizabeth Olsen, at the time the third Olsen sister that wasn't in the Olsen twins, who's now probably equally famous to them, and Aaron Taylor Johnson as Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch respectively. This was Aaron Taylor Johnson's second superhero role after playing Kick-Ass in the film Kick-Ass 5 years earlier. Ironically, Kick-Ass's best friend in that film would be played by Evan Peters, who was playing Quicksilver over at Fox during this film's production. So if you want to see another superhero film starring both versions of Quicksilver that also happens to loosely be a Marvel film, but by neither Fox nor Disney, you can watch Kick-Ass. That is certainly a story for another time, even more convoluted than this one. Though other than that, Paul Bettany would be upgraded from playing a voice role as Jarvis, as he had since Iron Man, into playing the Vision. Don Cheadle would appear as Rhodey in a brief appearance. Otherwise, the principal cast from the original Avengers would be back in its entirety, and that would round out the cast. The film began shooting in February 2014 for a May 2015 release, 3 years following the first entry of the Avengers series. The story starts on the original 6 Avengers on a mission to wipe out Hydra remnants following the events of Captain America the Winter Soldier and the group's reemergence since their seeming destruction at the end of World War II. This particular mission leads to the team tracking Baron von Strucker, who has gained possession of Loki's scepter, aka the Tesseract, aka the Cosmic Cube, aka the Mind Stone. Von Strucker is using the scepter to create new powerful weapons, as well as attempting to create new superhumans, with his subjects Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver attacking the Avengers. Iron Man secures the scepter, but his mind is attacked by Scarlet Witch while Quicksilver is outside, causing the other Avengers issues. Scarlet Witch, however, is shocked by what she sees in Tony's vision, allowing the Avengers to take the scepter while her and her brother flee, and Von Strucker is arrested. Bruce Banner and Tony start looking into the scepter's power, with Tony figuring he could give more sentience to his peacekeeping robots, the Iron Legion, if he used the scepter's powers. A group of robots the Avengers could use as an army if another Loki ever came to Earth or something. However, Tony can't track down how to make the thing work the way he wants, that is, until the Avengers are hosting a party and a nearly destroyed Iron Legion drone attacks the party. The drone identifying himself as Ultron.
Ultron.
In the flesh. Or no, not yet.
They capture the scientist, Dr. Cho, and run off with the scepter to an old Hydra base in Sokovia. Ultron recruits the Maximoff twins, with their origin being revealed, showing that their parents were killed by a Stark missile, hence their hatred towards Tony Stark. Wanda, knowing that Stark having the scepter would likely lead to his own undoing. Ultron kills Strucker and lures the Avengers to an arms deal he's holding with Ulysses Claw. The Avengers fight Ultron, with the robot gaining vibranium off of Claw that he stole from Wakanda, leading the villain to now have near invulnerable armor. Wanda infiltrates Bruce Banner's mind, making him Hulk and causing him to rampage through Johannesburg, South Africa, with Iron Man confronting him in his Hulkbuster armor. The fight and resulting damage leads the Avengers to be public enemies, which brings them to Hawkeye's farm, where they meet his wife and kids. Thor decides to leave the movie for a bit.
I saw something in that dream. I need answers. I won't find him here.
And Hulk and Black Widow plan to run off during all this, since they have a slapdash romance. But after Nick Fury shows up on the farm to give the Avengers a rousing speech, Bruce somehow comes up with the idea that Cho was kidnapped by Ultron as a means to get her synthetic skin technology. Okay, I guess. Anyhow, Ultron makes a synthetic body and plans to form it with the Mind Stone, while Cho is under the scepter's influence, though during the upload the twins have a change of heart and interrupt Ultron right as Captain America, Hawkeye, and Black Widow arrive to fight him, figuring that he would be at Chow's lab. The Avengers fight Ultron and grab Chow's machine along with the body inside, and bring it back to Avengers Tower, where Banner and Stark plan to double down and bring the body alive with Jarvis's consciousness or wavelength or whatever, since that would make the robot good. And they found out following Ultron taking over the Iron Legion, Jarvis fled into the internet. I don't know either. Anyhow, the twins try to stop this from happening, along with Captain America, but Thor, who I think we all kind of forgot was even in this movie, comes out of nowhere and brings the Mind Stone to life, creating the Vision. Thor then tells the Avengers about the Infinity Stones, and Vision explains that they need to stop Ultron. The now 9 Avengers head to Sokovia to fight Ultron, who is razing the city of Novigrad, Sokovia's capital, with ginormous engine he created out of the remaining vibranium and some Chitauri tech he managed to find. Anyways, the Avengers fight the Iron Legion and Ultron on this giant floating city, leading to them, of course, evacuating the thousands of civilians civilians and killing Ultron and the Legion in the process, but at the cost of Quicksilver, who died defending Hawkeye and a couple of children. It's okay though, because Aaron Taylor Johnson would return as Kraven the Hunter in the Sony Cinematic Universe of Marvel villain mockbuster films almost a decade later. So, I guess there's some consolation for you guys. This film has a number of new characters as always, so let's take a look, shall we? Quicksilver, or Pedro Maximoff, is fairly similar to his appearance from the comics, being a super speed-enhanced superhuman character. With that said, his core differences stem from the character's origins and background. In the comics, Quicksilver first appeared in X-Men issue 4 as a founding member of the Brotherhood of Mutants, ostensibly Magneto's evil X-Men. These days, there are more nuance to them, with it sort of being a Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X thing, and Magneto not being fully evil, kinda sorta, occasionally, depending who's writing him. Regardless, the reason his movie rights weren't fully owned by Fox was because, following a short stint on the Brotherhood, he and Scarlet Witch both left the team and eventually found their way over to the Avengers, being inducted to the team's second iteration, where Wasp, Hulk, Thor, and Iron Man were out, and the twins, along with Captain America, who stayed on the team, and Hawkeye, were in. This new micro-Avengers would lead the characters to be both categorized as Avengers and X-Men characters, since the characters were heavily featured in both worlds in the comics. Hence, this version lacked the mutant heritage of the comics and was instead created using the Mind Stone. Scarlet Witch also premiered in X-Men number 4, and much of what I said about Quicksilver still applies here, though where Quicksilver was more of an X-Men focused character later in his history, Scarlet Witch very much stayed on both sides of the coin. Famously, the Marvel event House of M, Wanda screws up the Marvel universe, saying no more mutants, and creates a rip in the timeline. She is very overpowered. In this first film, I feel she's a little undercooked, but later entries in the MCU, like her show WandaVision or Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, add to her character a lot, so we'll talk more about her down the line. Ultron is a super powerful robotic villain that menaces the Avengers constantly, first appearing in Avengers 54 from 1968. The biggest change to Ultron was really his origin story. In the comics, Hank Pym, the original Ant-Man, was messing around trying to create a super intelligent robot, succeeding by creating Ultron, who, after gaining sentience off Hank's brain waves, becomes Ultron. Ultron then hypnotized Hank and caused him to forget ever having made the robot. Ultron started building himself upgrades, upgrading himself to Ultron 5 by the time he finally confronted the Avengers for the first time. Ultron still upgrades himself here and there, but you get the idea. He also created the Vision, kind of like he did in this film, but it's a little bit different in the comics. Vision was created in Avengers 57 and is basically the same character from the film again, though with very different origins. Where Ultron just kind of whipped up Vision using Dr. Cho's tech in the film, in the comics, Ultron stole the deactivated body of Jim Hammond, the original Human Torch, who was a cyborg character from the 1940s, most famous for being recycled into the Human Torch character from the Fantastic Four. That character first appeared in Marvel number 1 from 1939, the comic that the company's name is now derived from. Regardless though, later it was retconned to be some clone of Hammond, because they wanted to bring back the OG Human Torch or something. Anyways, I wish I was done, but I'm not. Ultron gets Phineas Horton, who created the Human Torch, and gets him to make the thing with him, but this leads to Human Torch's good guy brainwaves being instilled into the Vision, which makes him good. On the side though, Ultron also mixed in Wonder Man's brainwaves, who used to be a villain at first and then became an Avenger. So Vision is more or less Ant-Man's grandson, whose dad is Ultron. He's in the body of the original Human Torch and has the mind of Wonder Man. In the film they just say fuck it, it's Jarvis, and that probably works better if I'm being totally honest. It's a little less convoluted, clearly. Wolfgang von Strucker appeared in this film after cameoing in Captain America the Winter Soldier. The character first appeared in Sergeant Fury #5 from 1963 and was a Nazi originally who helps in facilitating the rise of Hydra, at one point even being the group's supreme leader. He would often menace Sergeant Fury before the war comic was discontinued and Nick Fury would take over as the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. The film version is similar. He is a higher up in Hydra that did some experiments with Loki's scepter that caused the creation of Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. Pretty simple. Ulysses Claw first appeared in Fantastic Four #53 and was an enemy of Wakanda, hell-bent on taking its supply of animanium. In the comic, he has sonic powers and is literally immortal. In this film, he's just a dude that sells weapons and sells a stash of animanium to Ultron for his new body. The character resurfaces but never gets an absolutely goofy costume like the one he has from the comics, which absolutely sucks. I think this suit would have translated perfectly to the screen. This is notable as an early mention of Black Panther, though, who they're kind of foreshadowing for his first appearance in Captain America Civil War. Friday replaces Jarvis as Tony's suit AI for the suit scenes. Nothing too notable, though. Unlike Jarvis, who in the comics is a human butler, Friday in the comics was always an AI assistant that first appeared in Iron Man Volume 3, #53 from 2003. That was a lot of threes. Might as well mention the notable Iron Man suits here, as we always do. Mark 43 is the suit Tony starts the film with and uses throughout most of its runtime and is very loosely based on Model 13 from the comics and armor from Iron Man 300 from 1993 that Tony uses to control the Hulkbuster. This appearance isn't quite what the Model 13 is, but the suit works similarly to that model, so that's why I mention it. The Mark 44, or the Hulkbuster armor, was a series of armors, but started as an accessory of Model 13, though in the comics, the Hulkbuster would start as a standalone model for Model 31, and was primarily used to fight the Hulk, obviously. Mark 45 is the final armor, and is basically a standalone armor, and I think it's honestly one of the sleekest worn in the whole MCU. This armor looks pretty neat. Iron Man is definitely the main character in this film, and he is in all the Avengers films, honestly. In this film, Tony is obsessed with protecting the people of the world with his Iron Legion, something he wants to grant more autonomy over, mistakenly causing Ultron to be created, causing conflict between him and the other Avengers. Captain America takes extra offense to these steps in Tony's evolution, since it was a reflection of the helicarrier S.H.I.E.L.D. was creating through Project Insight from Captain America the Winter Soldier, which is basically unmanned and preemptive strikes on targets that the U.S. deems as dangerous.
I'm gonna say this once.
How about nunts?
Shut it down.
Nope, not gonna happen.
You don't know what you're doing.
And you do?
This also moves the rift between those heroes a bit further apart, leading to the events of Captain America Civil War shortly after this film, which we'll obviously come back to in our Phase 3 video. Captain America is basically just here to be mad at Tony and pad out the roster a bit, but this is still an essential role for the wider story of the MCU, as Tony's actions in this film directly leads to him and Tony's battle in Captain America 3, and also sets in motion Captain America's decision to put down the S.H.I.E.L.D. in Avengers Infinity War. Thor is also kind of just here for fights, very underutilized. He briefly leaves the film to have some dark visions of a possible future, but he's not super important in this film, and honestly, if he wasn't in the film, I doubt anyone, including myself, would have really noticed. Hulk is still hulking, which is a problem. As Banner, he lightly takes Tony's side in creating AI as a way to kind of not need to use the Hulk, which would greatly help him be at ease and protect him from causing massive collateral damage and deaths along the way. At one point, he is mind attacked by Scarlet Witch, causing him and Iron Man to fight, something that adds more to the future Sokovia Accords in Civil War, and leads him to jettison off planet, something resolved in Thor Ragnarok a couple years down the line. Hulk, due to his convoluted rights, couldn't get a movie made about him unless it was greenlit by Universal, who would distribute, and Marvel would have to do all the creative footwork, though he could appear in Avengers films without Universal's involvement. This is sort of a similar concept to the Spider-Man deal that's going on with Sony right now, but much less favorable for Universal, especially since Disney's not going to give up distribution for a movie they basically created, and given the fact that they can use Hulk in other films, just not make his own solo film without having to get Universal involved. That is why he gets lots of character progression in these Avengers films over some of the other side characters like Thor. This film tries a romance with Black Widow that ultimately feels rushed, goes nowhere, and was just another attempt at pairing her off with one of the Avengers.
I would have joined you, but it didn't seem like the right time.
Something they really wanted to do to no success throughout these films. It is never really substantially mentioned again in the MCU either. Black Widow is Hulk's support and calming presence. She sort of takes on the Betty role that was vacant since they didn't want to pay Liv Tyler presumably to come back and try to write her into the film as Betty Ross. Otherwise she's just fight scene fodder. Hawkeye doesn't do much but sits in the background shooting arrows, though he does have a bit of a rivalry throughout the film with Quicksilver, who eventually sacrifices his life for the Archer and some random civilians. On that note, Quicksilver is the first Avenger in the series to die, being killed fighting some Ultron sentries and protecting Hawkeye. He is definitely more fight scene fodder than his sister Scarlet Witch, though his rivalry with Hawkeye is cute and his death is marginally sad, if a bit of a waste given the fact that I think his death wouldn't get much further payoff until WandaVision almost 5 years down the line. Scarlet Witch is evil along with her brother, but mostly because she's mad at Tony Stark for seemingly killing her parents. That said, we eventually learned that was when Obadiah Stane from Iron Man 1 was in charge, hence the sale of the weapon to some shady characters. And following the Battle of Novigrad in Sokovia, she joins the Avengers. Her mind-influencing powers also occasionally influence the Avengers and cause disturbing visions for Tony Stark at one point, though she's still a tiny bit undercooked in this movie, mostly just being a plot device. Vision is born in this film and is the offspring of Ultron and the Mind Stone. He joins the Avengers and isn't really that important yet, but he comes more into play in the following films. Ultron is the big bad of this film and fights the Avengers hoping to save the Earth by eradicating humanity and making it a land of machines. He's the product of Iron Man and has a bit of that Tony Stark flair. A lot of quips and shit coming from this guy. He's interesting enough and kind of has the standard comic book Ultron motives. I also think he's an interesting choice for a villain, seeing as the previous film went magical fantasy with Loki, so something that's kind of a futuristic robot menace was kind of a fun contrast to that in my opinion. Tonally, this film is a bit darker than the first, with human experimentation, heartless robotic characters, and more, but still maintains, or perhaps amplifies, the quippy, lighthearted feel of the first Avengers film, which, while being a fan favorite in the first film, comes off a bit eye-rolly here, with Joss at times playing the hits and at times just going a bit too far with the humor, that it sort of undercuts the drama. For example, when they invade the Hydra base at the start of the film, Captain America is reprimanding Iron Man for swearing while they're basically in a battle.
Wait a second. No one else is going to deal with the fact that Cap just said language?
I know.
It's really strange to me and kind of adds a barrier between the dialogue of the film and what the film is actually showing us. If you watch my review of Joss Whedon's Justice League, you'll see this style started to wear on audiences by that film's release, a mere 5 years after the release of the Avengers. So I think both Warner Brothers and Disney, with their respective superhero films, started to kind of tone down that random humor that was so popular in the early 2010s. I think we also see some critics thinking it was a bit overdone even by this time as well. It feels very Reddit karma-esque or Tumblr baiting, where it just wanted to be a thing so bad, but it feels forced and not natural. Like writing in and cooking in improv, where the original feels at least a bit more like the actors hopped off scripts to have some fun and created some interesting jokes. Here, that's not the case as much, and it just feels so forced to try to get fans to relate to it or something. I'm not sure. The music in this film was done by Brian Tyler with Batman veteran Danny Elfman on support, and it's solid. Lots of music that follows the thesis set up in Alan Silvestri's work from the first film, while adding more industrial feeling tracks for this film, which makes sense given Ultron's the villain. A new version of the Avengers riff shows up, but they save it for the final battle so it isn't overplayed and allows that score to define the characters perfectly without becoming overutilized. Good stuff here. Jeffrey Ford is back editing this after previously editing Captain America the Winter Soldier, and Lisa Lassick joins the team as an editor known for her work with Joss Whedon on the Avengers, Serenity, and the Joss Whedon-produced Cabin in the Woods. The editing is pretty good, as always, quick and snappy, not overly long. I do think this film has some character management issues, which could be a problem with the editing or perhaps the script. Thor, Captain America to an extent, and Quicksilver all feel underutilized to me. I think Quicksilver was mostly added as part of Scarlet Witch's origin, which is fair, but Thor and Captain America were two of the big three Avengers characters who really set up the tone for the team, and they have pretty little going on. Captain America especially could have used a bit more screen time setting up more grievances with Tony to add some motivation to his then upcoming third film, where he and his team of outlaw Avengers goes against Tony and his sanctioned Avengers. It just feels a bit like a missed opportunity to add some more of that arc and set up the next big step for these characters. Ben Davis returned from Guardians of the Galaxy as the cinematographer, and thank God for him. I hate how the first Avengers looks. It's real flat, sterile, and stylist, which is so lame to me. I get the colors are supposed to pop to make it look like a comic, but like, move the fucking camera or something. The movie may be the worst looking movie in the MCU in my opinion. I put cinematography as one of the most important aspects in filmmaking for me as well, since it's a visual medium and I find it to be incredibly important. So with that, it is important to shoot something that doesn't lead to migraines, and this film did a pretty good job of not doing that. It's a bit more grimy, a bit greasy, which is fitting for Ultron, visually darker, and it looks great. The only exception being the Hulkbuster versus Hulk fight, which they threw the cliched it's Africa, so let's throw a piss yellow filter over it. Filmmakers do this a lot with South America as well, and it always looks like ass. Piss yellow should not be a color that films have in their color palettes. It just should not be allowed. Regardless, that is one 7-minute scene, so I can get past it, since the rest of the movie I think is generally appealing visually. This film has so much more personality than the first, and I love that. Ben Davis has a much different style than he did in Guardians of the Galaxy as well, and just to kind of see how he frames these characters against how he frames the Guardians is incredible, and I think it's nice that he has a variety even within the universe of the MCU. The post-credit scene again teases Thanos, this time with Thanos putting on his gauntlet, saying he is annoyed by the lack of progress in attaining the Infinity Stones, so he's going to personally collect them. It's kind of odd though, since no one in this film actually worked for him, and also Thanos looked like ass here. The close-up was just so bad.
I'll do it myself.
Look, it's a bit hokey, but they need to hype up the character, and I appreciate that they saved Thanos till the time is right, rather than having his ass get beat down by a powerless Ant-Man or something like they did with Kang. Thankfully, Jonathan Majors was fired though, so I never have to talk about a shitty Kang-based Avengers movie, but we'll come back to that way down the line, don't worry. We'll get to him. I don't normally talk much about the CGI, since I think story and overall visuals should come over the field of CGI, which solely depends on how much money the studio can toss at it. But this film looks really good. Ultron has a good design, though when he talks it looks a little bit weird.
I'm glad you asked that, because I wanted to take this time to explain my evil plan.
I almost would have preferred they just did what they did in the comics, where his face is a hard head, basically, not articulated, then subtle lights showed when the character talked or whatever. I'm sure it was a lot of concept art and stuff that led to the decision to make him have the moving mouth, but it looks a tiny bit weird and uncanny valley. Iron Man's suit is also very CGI heavy in this one. Each film it looks less and less real, since they insert more and more CGI, and it occasionally just looks a bit odd and not real. I sort of wish more elements were still practical, then they just touched it up with CG, but I guess going through multiple suits per film would be much harder if they actually had to do the models. Plus these films have so many moving parts as it is, and so much more happens in camera that it likely would have been such a hassle to do, so I understand, but I still wish it was a little more practical. I thought it was also a tiny bit funny that Hawkeye had a secret family. I think they kind of considered setting up a romance between him and Black Widow, and with Iron Man taken, Thor was taken and the dynamic with Captain America didn't work. And since they absolutely insisted on giving Black Widow a romance, Hawkeye and Hulk were kind of the options they had. They tried Captain America, but it didn't work out since the vibe was too boring. But then they chose Hulk in an attempt to make Black Widow sort of the superhero version of Betty from the comics, I think. So at that point they had to write Hawkeye out as a romantic possibility, and they just kind of ass-pulled a wife.
Yeah, we would have called ahead, but we were busy having no idea that you existed.
Yeah, well,
マーベルズストーリーチーム
help me set this up.
I don't know, seems sort of dumb. It also just sort of wrote Hawkeye out of having anything interesting to happen with him. I think the Russos and the snap from Infinity War added some tension back to Hawkeye, but yeah, it was kind of a weird idea they had here with the whole secret family retcon and the fact that Hawkeye, who constantly interacted with Black Widow in the first film, was kind of backseated since Black Widow's scenes all have to do with the Hulk. Like, what the fuck is he still doing here? Avengers Age of Ultron is okay. The problems with this film boil down to too many quips, the poorly done Hulk-Black Widow romance, and just too many characters along with lots of retreading not so long after the first film. The finale feels similar despite it being a flying city this time rather than just the streets of New York. The Avengers run around fighting nameless villains, then they do a dramatic circle up and fight lots of enemies together, then they fight the villain before Hulk beats him down comically hard when he's defeated. It's the exact same formula. On the other hand though, this film did what the first film did, but better, primarily since it's shot worlds better than the first film, which I think is the X factor that makes me prefer this film just a slight bit over the first. Is it perfect? No. But it's a more watchable version of the concept, despite this film being all but obsolete since the release of Infinity War and Endgame, which are much more refined and less formulaic than these films. Avengers Age of Ultron made a massive $1.4 billion, a decent step up from the first, and that's a lot of money. These films sort of set up the billion-dollar or failure mentality Hollywood would have, which lasted for a solid little while before COVID kind of reset Hollywood's expectations a bit, and with streaming, the revenue sources have switched. Things like stock prices on streaming services and brands, along with ticket sales and streaming numbers, are more the new metrics of success over just hard ticket sales, so this probably won't be the norm again anytime soon, with Phase 2 and Phase 3 definitely being the peak of this franchise in terms of box office hauls, unless Avengers Secret Wars just surprises the hell out of all of us. Along with that, this film costed $440 to $490 million, a budget that is just way too much these days. Again though, with AI and stuff, I would be shocked if we see these budgets often anymore these days, with, I'm sure, many jobs being cut off the chopping block if they can be fulfilled by computers for cheaper. Regardless though, Disney wanted to outdo the first film, and that took lots of resources to achieve with a bigger scope and a bigger cast that was demanding more cash to return to this unprecedented position they found themselves in as pioneers of the MCU, put on pre-MCU as large entity contracts that were a lot less of you signing away 10 appearances as is basically expected now. The film, despite being looked back on as a weaker entry in the MCU, still did well critically, with a 76% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 66 out of 100 on Metacritic. This would pretty well set up the Avengers for Phase 3, the final phase of this first saga in the MCU, with one more introductory film, Ant-Man, to wrap up the MCU's second phase.